From the notes of Dr. John H. Watson. Late of the Army Medical Department, it is, I confess, a singular thing that the mind like a well-ordered cabinet will preserve with curious exactitude certain trifles which, at the time of their occurrence, seemed hardly worth the dust of remembrance. A smear of candle grease upon a glove, the faint grit of street mud upon a trouser cuff, the odor of damp wool steaming by a fire, such details return to me with a vividness which the more momentous features of life cannot always command. So it is that, as I set myself to record this strange affair which my friend Sherlock Holmes afterwards entitled "The Footprints Stop at the Wall, then Continue on the Ceiling," I find my memory fastens not first upon the crime itself, nor even upon the shock it gave to London, but upon a quiet evening in Baker Street. Upon the yellow glow of the lamp, the soft rasp of Holmes's violin string beneath his fingers, and the thin, persistent rattle of rain against the window panes. The autumn had come early that year. A fog, born of river damp and coal smoke, had crept from the Thames and laid itself in folds along the streets, as though London were some vast stage and the city's lamps but feeble footlights straining to shine through the gauze. We had dined, and Holmes, who ate when it pleased him, and as little as necessity demanded, had contented himself with a few mouthfuls, while I, being less ascetic in such matters, did fuller justice to Mrs. Hudson's excellent roast. Afterwards, my friend had fallen into one of those long silences which were as much a part of him as his aquiline profile and his gray, penetrating eyes. He lay at length upon the sofa, his hands joined, his elbows raised, the tips of his long fingers touching, and his gaze fixed upon the ceiling with an abstraction so complete that it might have been carved in marble. From time to time he would stir, reach for his pipe, and then, after a puff or two, set it down again as if the mere act of smoking were too gross an interruption to some finer inner process. I had taken up the Bradshaw more, I fear from habit than interest, and was endeavoring to make sense of a tangle of railway times, when a sudden movement from Holmes caused me to lower the book. "You are thinking of the Crimea again," said he. I stared at him in honest amazement. "Holmes, I have not had the Crimea in my head these 10 years. And yet," he returned languidly, "for the last 5 minutes you have been rubbing the ball of your left thumb with your right forefinger, precisely as you did, Watson, when the old wound pained you in the trenches before Sevastopol. You have also twice glanced at the corner of the mantelpiece where your Afghan service medal stands. The human mind may forget, but the human body is a more faithful historian." "You astound me," I cried, though I ought by then to have grown accustomed to such exhibitions. "No, no, you astound yourself," said he, and the ghost of a smile flickered upon his thin lips. "You imagine your thoughts to be private, when in truth they advertise themselves by 100 little signals. It is merely that most men have no practice in reading them." He spoke with that half-contemptuous patience which he reserved for the ordinary limitations of mankind. Yet there was in his voice a softness also, as if my companionship, such as it was, had become a familiar comfort to him, in spite of his frequent protestations against sentiment. "What do you make of this?" I asked, for I had learned that it was wiser to humor the current of his mind than to attempt to divert it. Holmes had risen, and was standing now before the fireplace. Upon the rug lay a small object, something which I had not noticed before in the half-light. He pointed to it with the stem of his pipe. I stooped and picked it up. It was a child's toy, one of those little tin soldiers painted in gaudy colors, with a rifle fixed eternally at the shoulder. The head was dented, and there was a curious smear of white along the figure's back. "Where did that come from?" I asked. Holmes's eyes glittered. "Excellent, Watson. You ask the first question. Most men would ask the second, which is to say, what is it? And even that they would ask only after they had trodden upon it. It came, as you see, from our own stair. Mrs. Hudson brought up the coal an hour ago and found it on the second step." "And you infer?" that it was dropped there within the last day. The paint is scarcely dulled, and there is no soot upon it such as would accumulate in a common passageway over time. Also, observe the smear of white. It looks like chalk. Very good. And yet there is no chalk in this room. Nor, I venture to say, have we had a child visitor. No. So the toy is a messenger, said Holmes, and chalk its signature. At that moment, before I could frame a reply, there came a sharp, impatient ring at the bell below, followed almost instantly by Mrs. Hudson's footsteps, hurrying with more haste than her years generally permitted. "Mr. Holmes, sir," she called even before she had reached the landing. "There's a gentleman below, an inspector from Scotland Yard, and he says it's most urgent." Holmes's whole attitude altered in an instant. The languor vanished, the eyes sharpened, and the long, nervous energy of the man seemed to spring tight as a bowstring. "Show him up." Mrs. Hudson. A minute later, Inspector Lestrade entered our sitting room, bringing with him the fog and wet of the street. He was a small man with sharp features and bright, restless eyes, an embodiment of official activity, with just enough imagination to make him dangerous, and just little enough to make him dependent upon my friend's genius. "Evening, Mr. Holmes, Doctor," he nodded to me curtly, for Lestrade never wasted courtesy when business pressed. "I'm sorry to come at this hour, but there's a job. There's a damned queer job that I don't pretend to understand." Holmes waved him to a chair, though he himself remained standing, his hands behind his back, his head slightly inclined to pose. I had often seen him adopt when his mind was already racing ahead of the facts. "Queer in what fashion?" said he. Lestrade hesitated. For all his bravado, I could see that something had shaken him. "It's at Lower Grosvenor Street," he said at last. "The house of Sir Barnaby Eustace." Holmes's eyelids flickered. Sir Barnaby Eustace was a name even. Kay knew, one of those elderly magnates whose wealth and influence seemed stitched into the very fabric of the empire. Rumor credited him with half the shares in half the railways of Britain, and the other half in certain ventures of a less public character. "A man of means," Holmes murmured. "And, I recall, a man of anxieties." "He's got more now," said Lestrade grimly. "His private secretary, Mr. Rupert Lavington, has been found dead in the house." I felt my own fingers tighten upon the arm of my chair. "Murder?" I asked. "That's the question. There's no wound, no blood, no sign of struggle. But he's dead as a doornail, Dr. Stone Cold, and his face is like a man who has looked into hell and seen his own name written there." Holmes's eyes had narrowed. "And the queer part." Lestrade drew a breath, and then, as if ashamed of the words, he forced them out quickly. "The footprints?" said he. "The footprints stop at the wall, then continue on the ceiling." There was a silence so complete that I could hear the rain pattering upon the glass and, from somewhere below, the faint clink of Mrs. Hudson arranging the supper tray. I looked from Lestrade to Holmes, expecting at least a flash of skepticism. Instead, I saw what startled me more, a kind of eager concentration, as if the inspector had spoken not nonsense, but music. "Continue," said Holmes, very softly. Lestrade leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "It's in the secretary's sitting room, carpeted, only one set of footprints, wet with rain and street mud, coming from the window straight across the carpetand. Then they stop dead at the far wall, as clean as if the man had vanished. But above in the ceiling there's another line of footprints. The very same pattern, the very same mud, going on from the point where the first line ended, only upside down. They lead across the ceiling to the door." "To the door?" Holmes repeated. "Aye, and the door opens to the corridor. But in the corridor there's nothing. No marks on the floor, no mud, no sign of anyone. Just that room with the prints below and the prints above." I confess I felt a chill. For the mind of man is so constituted that, when confronted by an impossibility, it tends, however, unwillingly towards the supernatural as a refuge. Could it be a hoax? I suggested. Some trick to mislead? That's what I thought, snapped Lestrade. And then I thought maybe the ceiling's been meddled with, or there's some blasted contraption. But it's a plaster ceiling. Sound as a bell, no panels, no beams showing. And here's another thing, he broke off, and fumbled in his coat-dash pocket. Holmes held out his hand without a word. Lestrade produced a small paper packet and placed it in Holmes's palm. My friend opened it with the delicacy of a surgeon unveiling a wound. Inside lay a pinch of grayish powder. "Dust," said Holmes. From the ceiling, Lestrade returned, "just where the prints are thickest." One of the constables scraped it off with his knife. Holmes brought it to the light, sniffed it, and then, before I could protest, touched the tiniest amount to the tip of his tongue. His face remained expressionless, but I saw his nostrils quiver. "Not merely dust," said he. "You have done very well to bring this, Lestrade." Lestrade blinked. Praise from Holmes was so rare that it disconcerted him more than rebuke. "So will you come?" "So will you come?" Holmes turned, and his gaze fell quite unexpectedly upon the little tin soldier which still lay upon my side table where I had placed it. For the briefest instant, something like recognition passed over his features. "Yes," said he, "I will come." He moved with rapid decision now, crossing to the mantelpiece where he kept his instruments, selecting a lens and a small tape measure, slipping them into his pocket. Then he turned to me. "Watson, you will accompany me." "Of course." Holmes took up his coat, but paused with his hand upon it. "One more question, Lestrade," said he. "You said the footprints begin at the window. Is the window open?" It was Lestrade answered. "But the latch is not broken. And outside the window, there's a narrow ledge. A man could stand there if he had nerve." Holmes nodded, as though this confirmed some private calculation. "And Sir Barnaby?" "He's in a state," said Lestrade shortly. "Says he heard nothing. Says Lavington was with him earlier, then went to his room. Says he's been robbed, 2 papers missing from his safe." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Papers? Of what nature?" Lestrade shifted uneasily. "That's just it. Sir Barnaby won't say. He calls them private matters of national importance, and he'd rather die than have them in the newspapers." Holmes gave a short laugh. "Then let us prevent both deaths and newspapers, if we can. Come, Watson." Within 5 minutes we were descending the familiar stairs, the gas lamps hissing in the passage below, the fog pressing close against the panes like some curious face. As we stepped into the street, the hansom which Lestrade had summoned rolled up to the curb, its horse steaming faintly in the chill. Holmes paused one last time upon the threshold of Baker Street and lifted his head, sniffing the air as a hound might do. "Interesting," he murmured. "What is it?" I asked. "Chalk," said he simply. "And something else besides, something faint but unmistakable. A sweet chemical note, like the breath of a closed laboratory." Lestrade stared. "There's chalk all over London," he protested. Every builder, every school. Holmes stepped into the cab without answering. I followed, and the vehicle lurched forward into the fog as we rattled through the dim streets. I observed my friend's profile in the shifting light of the lamps. His expression had that peculiar intensity which always came upon him at the start of a case, a look of lean delight, as if the world had at last presented him with a puzzle worthy of his powers. "Holmes," I said quietly, "you do not truly believe that footprints can continue upon a ceiling?" He turned to me, and there was amusement in his eyes. "My dear Watson," said he, "I do not believe in impossibilities. I believe only in men and in the numerous ways in which they persuade other men that impossibilities have occurred." The cab swung round a corner. Ahead, through the fog, a row of tall houses loomed black, solemn, and wealthy, their lamps burning behind heavy curtains. The wheels slowed upon the cobbles, and Lestrade's voice came sharp and low. "There," said he. "Lower Grosvenor Street. That's Sir Barnabas." And so, with the muffled city about us and the rain turning the lamplight into wavering halos, we came at last to the door behind which a man lay dead. And where if Lestrade spoke true, someone had walked into a wall and out upon the ceiling. Lestrade's haste was such that, before I had time to settle my coat collar against the damp, we were already within Sir Barnaby Eustace's house, and had passed from the glossy, well-appointed hall into regions where wealth gave way to secrecy. The lamps burned low, as if even the servants feared to throw too much light upon what had occurred, and the air held that peculiar mingling of hot oilcloth, extinguished candles, and the faint metallic tang which I have always associated with sudden alarm in closed rooms. Sir Barnaby himself met us in the corridor, an elderly man with a heavy, pale face and the watery eye of one who has spent his life in negotiations where trust is expensive. He clutched the lapels of his dressing gown as though he were cold, yet his brow shone with perspiration, and his voice, when he spoke, had the strained exactness of a man determined not to betray more than he must. "You are Mr. Holmes. Thank God. This is a monstrous business, monstrous. Rupert was indispensable to me. Indispensable." He shot a quick glance at Lestrade, and then at me, as though measuring the danger of additional ears. "You will be discreet, I beg you." Holmes inclined his head with the air of one who accepts discretion as a matter of course and not as a favor. "You have lost papers, Sir Barnaby." Sir Barnaby's fingers tightened until the knuckles stood out white. "Who has been talking?" "No one," said Holmes. "Your house has—" There was a moment when the old man looked as though he might protest, but Holmes was already moving past him, following Lestrade to the secretary's rooms. We entered first a small antechamber, and then the sitting-room itself, and there, at the threshold, I confess my professional composure wavered. Mr. Rupert Lavington lay upon his back, beside a writing-table. One arm flung out, the other bent oddly at the elbow, as if he had reached for something and failed. His face was gray, the lips drawn back from the teeth, and the eyes half-lidded had that dreadful fixedness I had seen on battlefields when death came without warning. Yet there was no bruise upon him, no cut, no sign of violence. It was not the body, however, that held my gaze, but the carpet. Across its rich pattern ran a track of muddy footprints, each one as distinct as if stamped in clay. They came from the open window where rain whispered, and Anne crossed the room in a direct line to the far wall. There they ceased, abruptly, with no scuff, no hesitation, no turning. It was as if the walker had stepped into the plaster and been absorbed. My eyes traveled upwards in spite of myself, and I felt my scalp tighten. For thereon the ceiling were more prints, inverted, running onward from the point above the last mark on the floor. Traversing the plaster to the door, Lestrade gave a little grunt of triumph, as if the sight justified his summons. "Well, you see it now." Holmes said nothing. He had dropped to one knee at once, his lens in his hand, his long face close to the carpet. He followed the line of prints slowly, as a man might read a line of print in a strange language, pausing here and there to study a particular letter. I, too, bent down, noting the pattern. A common boot, moderately worn, with a small nick at the outer edge of the heel. The mud was thick, gritty, and dark London street mud, with its inevitable admixture of horse dung and cinders. Holmes touched none of it with his fingers. Instead, he produced from his pocket a slip of paper and held it near, as though comparing color. Then rose and crossed to the wall where the trail ended. At that spot, the wallpaper, expensive, subdued design, showed nothing unusual. Holmes pressed his palm flat against it, then rapped gently with his knuckles, listening as intently as a doctor listens for the note of a diseased lung. He stepped back, lifted his eyes to the ceiling, and I saw the faintest change in his expression, a quick sharpening. like a hound that has caught scent. "The ceiling is new," said he. Sir Barnaby started. "New? No, sir. It is as it has always been." Holmes's gaze remained upon the plaster. "It has been replastered within the year. The surface is too smooth for age, and the joint at the cornice has been reworked. Also, there is less soot than one would expect in a London room with gas light. Your man has been improving the house." Barnaby's face hardened. "We have had repairs." Holmes drifted to the writing table. Upon it stood a green-shaded lamp, an inkstand, a blotter, and several orderly piles of correspondence. One drawer had been forced, but not clumsily. It had the look of a thing opened by someone who knew precisely where to put pressure. Holmes's fingers hovered above the wood like a pianist's above keys. He glanced at the corpse without emotion, and then, with sudden swiftness, stooped to pick something from the carpet near Lavington's hand. He held it up between thumb and forefinger. It was a flake-white, brittle plaster, I murmured. "Or something masquerading as plaster," said Holmes. He turned to Lestrade. "How many men have been in this room since the body was found?" "Too many," Lestrade admitted. "Constables, the butler, Sir Barnaby, myself." Holmes's mouth tightened. "Then we must content ourselves with what survives." "Watson, observe the mud. Not merely wet. It has been wetted twice. Once by rain, once by something else." I stared at him. "How can you know that?" He pointed with his lens. "The outer edge has a sheen which the inner does not. Rain falls from above. The second wetting came from a lower angle. A splash perhaps from a bucket in the corridor, perhaps from a puddle on the ledge. We shall see." Lestrade folded his arms. "What about the ceiling prints? How does a man walk up there, then?" Holmes looked at him with mild irritation. "By persuading you that he has." He moved to the door and studied the handle. "Someone left this room by the door, Lestrade. Someone who took pains to wipe his boots after exiting, or else never. Had mud upon them by that time, and the prints above." Lestrade persisted. Holmes's eyes traveled again to the ceiling. "A message, a taunt, or a device to make you stare upwards while the truth lies under your feet." Sir Barnaby's voice broke in, thin and urgent. "Mr. Holmes, I care nothing for taunts. I want my papers." Holmes turned upon him, and for the first time there was steel in his tone. "Then tell me what they are." The old man's lips trembled, but he did not answer. Holmes held his gaze a moment longer, then let it pass, as if storing the refusal for later use. He walked to the open window and leaned out into the rain, his coat unbuttoned, indifferent to the weather. I followed and saw the narrow ledge outside, glistening slick, and below it the dark drop to the area railings. Holmes drew back and sniffed, just as he had at Baker Street. "Chalk," said he softly, almost to himself, and the sweet note again. "Yes, yes, indeed." Holmes had scarcely withdrawn his head from the rain-washed window when a movement in the corridor drew our attention. A tall footman, pale with the strain of the last hour, stood twisting his hands as though he would wring the news from them by sheer force. At Lestrade's curt nod, he ventured a step inside, glanced once at the body, and recoiled with a sharp intake of breath. "It's the housekeeper, sir," he stammered. She says there's summat queer in the morning room. Another set o' marks." Lestrade swore under his breath. Sir Barnaby made a choking sound, half anger and half fear, and turned upon the servant as if the poor fellow had invented the matter. "More of this nonsense?" he cried. "Am I to have the whole house turned into a fairground?" Holmes's eyes, however, had become very bright indeed. "What sort of marks?" said he. "Like tracks, sir. Like, you know." On the floor, the man looked helplessly at the ceiling, and I saw his skin prickle with the superstitious dread which such a notion must inspire. On the wall by the skirting, like a child had walked sideways. Holmes's quick glance went to the tin soldier, which I had put into my pocket earlier out of habit rather than intent. There was, I began to perceive, a thread fine as a hair, but tensile as wire running between these childish tokens and the cold adult malice which lay upon the carpet. "Before us, Lestrade," said Holmes. "You will oblige me by keeping Sir Barnaby here for the present. Watson, come." He brushed past the footman and moved down the corridor with that swift, noiseless stride of his. So unlike the heavy tread of officialdom, the morning-room lay upon the same floor, facing the street, and was arranged with that stiff, elaborate comfort which the rich mistake for taste. Yet the lamps were lit and the curtains half drawn, and in their uncertain glow the disturbance was plain. Along one panel of the wall, just above the skirting board, ran a line of muddy impressions, small ones as if made by a narrow boot, or even by a child's shoe. They progressed laterally for 3 feet, halted, and then resumed this time higher until they vanished behind a heavy drape. Lestrade, who had followed us in spite of Holmes's instruction, let out a sound between a laugh and a groan. "Now, this is getting beyond a joke," said he. "What do you call that, Mr. Holmes?" "A man crawling like a lizard." Holmes did not answer at once. He had dropped upon one knee and was examining the marks with his lens. Then he rose, crossed to the fireplace, and with the tip of his finger scraped at the wall where one print was thickest. A faint dust came away gray-white, like that which Lestrade had brought in his packet. "Your repairs, Sir Barnaby," said Holmes, without turning, "were they done by your own men?" The old man, who had been ushered in and now stood rigid by the door, seemed to shrink into his gown. "A contractor," he said. "A man Hargreaves recommended." Holmes nodded, as though the name were less important than the manner of its utterance. "Recommended by whom?" Sir Barnaby's jaw worked. "By Mr. Lavington." Holmes's head came round sharply. For an instant there was a look upon his face which I can only describe as pity contemptuously held in check. "Then we may set down," said he, "that Mr. Lavington's usefulness extended beyond his pen." Lestrade bristled. "Are you accusing the dead man now? It's convenient, he can't answer." "I accuse no one yet," returned Holmes. "But I observe that he introduced into this house a plasterer, that chalk appears where it should not, that chemical odors linger, and that we are asked to believe in men who walk like flies. One does not require spirit trappings when mortars and motive will suffice." He drew aside the heavy drape. Behind it was a narrow service door, partly concealed by the curtain, leading to a passage which ran toward the back staircase. Holmes examined the floor before it. There were no footprints, none at all. Yet the wall bore the curious trail, as if something had been carried along it and lifted at intervals. I ventured a question. "Holmes, if these are not true footprints, what are they?" He glanced at me, and there was that familiar twinkle, the spark of enjoyment at a problem well posed. "You have answered yourself by the manner of your inquiry, my dear Watson. Not who nor how, but what. They are not prints made by a living foot striking downwards with weight. Observe, there is no compression of the plaster grain at the edges, no crushing of the nap where the mud touches the wall. It is laid undabbed, as a painter might dab. A stamp, I suggested. Precisely. A stamp which imitates the tread. And why? To compel Scotland Yard to fix its eyes upon the impossible. A man who can persuade you that he has walked upon the ceiling can persuade you of other things besides." Lestrade's face darkened. "Then you're saying the fellow was never on the ceiling at all?" "I am saying," Holmes replied, "that ceilings do not interest me nearly so much as corridors." He pushed open the service door. The passage beyond was narrow, dim, and lined with cupboards. At the far end, a stair descended, and the faint scent which had puzzled me before, sweet, sharp, and chemical, was stronger here. Holmes halted, lifted his head, and sniffed like a connoisseur of perfumes. Chloroform, I hazarded, recalling too well the sickly sweetness of it in surgery. Holmes's eyes flickered approval. Close. But older cruder, a tradesman, might purchase without questions. Ether, perhaps, or a compound. Enough to dull the senses, not necessarily to render unconscious. Enough to make a man fail to wake when his safe is opened in the next room. Sir Barnaby made a strangled sound behind us. Safe, he whispered. Holmes's voice turned cold. Do not insult me, sir. Your secretary is dead, your papers are missing, and your house reeks of solvents. If you do not possess a safe, then you possess something you are ashamed to call one. Lestrade stepped forward. Lestrade, if you know this much, give me a name. Give me something solid. Holmes bent, and with his finger traced a faint line along the passage floor where the boards met. There, barely visible, was a smear not mud, but a thin, chalky residue. Solid, said Holmes softly. Here is solid. A man has been carrying. Powdered plaster in his boots, or in a bag, and he has not been so careful as he thinks. He has moved through this passage after the impossible display was made. Now Lestrade, send a constable to find this contractor Hargreaves. Quietly, no noise. No warrant waved about like a flag. We must know where he is before he knows. We seek him, and if he's gone, Lestrade demanded. Holmes smiled a thin, unsettling curve. Then we shall follow the chalk. At that moment, a muffled commotion rose from below, voices, hurried steps, and the sharp cry of a woman. The footman who had first summoned us came racing up the stairs again, his face ashen. It's in the nursery. He gasped. The little Miss She's taken poorly. The governess says someone's been in there. There's a smell like spirits. Holmes was already moving. Watson, he called, and in that single word was all the urgency of a battlefield surgeon's summons. We flew down the corridor, our boots thudding on the carpet, and I felt the old grim readiness return, the readiness to meet suffering, and, if I could, to stave it off. The nursery door stood open. Within, a young woman in a governess's plain dress knelt beside a small bed where a child lay limp, her cheeks unnaturally pale, her breathing shallow. The woman looked up, her eyes wide with terror. She won't wake, she whispered. I stepped out only a minute only to fetch water, and, when I returned, the window was open and the room smelled of ether. There were marks on the ceiling. Sir, on the ceiling. Holmes's gaze went at once, not to the ceiling, but to the child's pillow. There, half hidden beneath the lace, lay a tiny tin soldier, its painted rifle still raised, its dented head gleaming dully in the lamplight, and along its back, as before, was the faint smear of white dot. Holmes picked it up delicately, as if it were a live coal. A warning, said he, or a promise. I thrust past him to the bedside, my medical instincts overriding all else. The odor was unmistakable now. The child's pulse fluttered beneath my fingers like a trapped bird. She has been drugged, I said. Not heavily, perhaps, but enough, Holmes. This is monstrous. Lestrade's face had gone a shade whiter. What kind of fiend drags a child into it? The kind, Holmes answered, his voice very quiet, who must keep Sir Barnaby silent at any cost. He turned to the old man, who stood in the doorway trembling like a leaf in a gale. You will speak now, Sir Barnaby? What are those? Papers. Sir Barnaby's lips worked soundlessly, and for an instant I thought the man might collapse outright. He stared at the little tin soldier in Holmes's hand as if it were a pistol leveled at his heart. Then his gaze shifted to the child, and something in him gave way with a shuddering breath. They were letters, he whispered. Not merely letters, copies. Copies of correspondence between myself and a foreign agent years ago. God help me, I did not know what I was doing. It was a business arrangement at first, and then it became leverage. My secretary kept them locked away. I paid him well to keep them, kept him well fed and well dressed and well silent. I did not think," his voice cracked. "I did not think anyone else knew." Holmes's expression did not soften, but there was a bleak understanding in his eyes. And now someone knows. Someone who has moved beyond blackmail into coercion. Lestrade, who had grown very still, cleared his throat. "Foreign agent, you say? Treason." Sir Barnaby flinched. "Not in the vulgar sense. Nothing that would endanger ships or troops, but enough to ruin me, and perhaps to embarrass certain persons who once dined at my table and took my money with a smile. I am an old man, Inspector. I have lived long enough to know that reputations, like stained glass, do not mend once cracked." Holmes put the tin soldier down upon the mantel of the nursery with a carefulness that struck me as deliberate, almost ceremonial. "Watson," said he, "tend to the child. Fresh air, warm tea if she can swallow, and keep her lying on her side. Ether narcosis rarely kills in such a dose, but it can frighten a small body into a deeper faint. I will not have her harmed further." I was grateful for the command, for my hands had been itching to act. I opened the window wider, ignoring. The wet and the cold air rolled in, flushing the sweet, cloying vapor from the room. The governess hovered like a frightened bird, but at my brisk instructions she fetched blankets and a spoon. The child stirred faintly at last, and my heart eased. Holmes, meanwhile, had turned away from the bedside and was already examining the nursery with the same detached intensity with which he had studied the death room. It was a charming chamber, papered with faded flowers and furnished with the clean simplicity which wealth affords when it chooses to be kind. Yet the window was smeared on its sill with the same gray-white dust. And upon the carpet, where one might have expected muddy prints if a man had entered, there was only a thin scatter of grittaz, though someone had shaken his boots carefully. Before stepping inside, Lestrade saw it too. "He's learned," he muttered. "He's tidied himself." Holmes nodded. "Or he has changed his shoes." He crossed to the toy box in the corner and lifted its lid. The air within held a faint odor of paint and old wood. Holmes sifted the contents with a quick, discriminating glance. Dolls with cracked porcelain faces, a wooden hoop, a set of painted blocks, several tin figures, and a small soldier-shaped stencil cut from thin metal. He held up the stencil and looked at Lestrade. "This is how your ceiling walker travels," said he. Lestrade's mouth fell open. "You mean he stamps the mud with that?" Holmes turned the stencil over. The edges were slightly raised. The inner tread pattern had been pressed with a precision that suggested a craftsman's hand. A boot tread cut to size. Mud or soot mixed with water, dabbed on, then pressed where it will best scandalize. The ceiling is merely a canvas. Sir Barnaby, who had been watching, swayed and gripped the doorframe. Then Rupert. Rupert was killed for these letters. Holmes's gaze went to him sharply. Not only killed, used. The body is part of the theater. At that, Lestrade recovered his professional temper. The contractor Hargreaves will have him in irons before morning. Holmes's voice was cool. "You will try, if he is the hand, he is not the mind." "What mind, then?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes stepped to the child's small writing desk. It was the sort of thing a doting grandfather might buy. Polished wood, a tiny inkwell, a place for pencils. On its surface lay a sheet of paper upon which the little girl had been practicing her letters in a wavering hand. Holmes's long finger traced the indentations. "She wrote recently," he observed. The governess nodded, swallowing. "Before supper, sir. She was very proud of her bees." Holmes lifted the paper and held it to the lamp. Beneath the child's clumsy lettering was another impression, faint, angular, hurried. Not from her hand at all, but from a stronger pressure on a sheet above it. "A message," said Holmes. I left the bedside long enough to see him take from his pocket a small pouch of black powder and a soft brush. He dusted the page lightly, and the faint indentations darkened into legible words. It was no child's hand that had written them. "Payment moved. Keep silent. Next token will bite." The last word was underlined, so hard that it tore the paper. Lestrade stared, then swore. "That's blackmail plain enough." Holmes's eyes remained upon the note, and also instruction. "Payment moved, so the thief has already shifted the letters. Keep silent. Sir Barnaby is to refrain from going to the authorities. Next token will bite. The toy soldier is a token, and it has already done harm by bringing ether to a child. A bite may be metaphorical or it may be literal. There are poisons that leave no wound and yet set the face in terror." My mind flashed back to Lavington's ghastly expression in Death. "Holmes," I said, "lo, you think he was poisoned?" "I think." Holmes replied that he was shown something he recognized, then given something he could not fight. Sir Barnaby's voice was scarcely audible. "What? What can I do?" Holmes faced him fully now, and in the lamplight his austere features looked carved from bone. "You will do precisely what I tell you, Sir Barnaby. You will send word through the same channel by which you have paid before that you are frightened into compliance. You will request a meeting to finalize matters and to secure the return of your papers. You will offer more money than you can afford and less than you will pay. You will do it tonight." Lestrade stiffened. "You can't. Use him as bait." Holmes's glance cut like a knife. A man has already used his own granddaughter as bait. Inspector Only the hook was set by someone else. If you wish to protect the child, you will stop blustering and begin listening. For a moment, the two men faced one another. Scotland Yard's sturdy obstinacy against the cold, high logic of Baker Street. Then Lestrade looked away, beaten not by force, but by necessity. "How will you catch him?" he asked grudgingly. Holmes's thin smile returned, and in it I saw the fierce delight of the hunter who has at last sighted the spoor. "He has left chalk, plaster dust, ether, toy soldiers, and false miracles," said Holmes. "In exchange, I shall leave him something he cannot resist: certainty. When a criminal believes the game is his, he will always step closer to the fire." The child gave a small sigh and turned her head upon the pillow. I returned to her at once, but even as I tended her, I felt the air of the house changing, as if the very walls had begun to listen. Somewhere in the depths below, a clock chimed the hour with slow solemnity, and through the fog-muted window I could see the lamps of London burning like dim, watchful eyes. Holmes bent once more to the paper, then folded it and slipped it into his pocket as calmly as a man pocketing a handkerchief. "Come, Watson," said he. "The ceiling walker has given us his handwriting. Now we must give him our reply." Holmes's reply was composed in Sir Barnaby's own study. A somber chamber whose heavy curtains and leather-bound respectability seemed designed to smother every inconvenient truth. The old man sat at his desk like an accused criminal, his pen trembling between fingers that had signed 1,000 contracts, while Lestrade paced behind him with the impatience of a caged terrier. Holmes, by contrast, lounged by the fire with his hands in his pockets, watching the pen's nib as a physician watches the pulse of a fevered patient. "You will write as you have written before," said Holmes. "No heroics, no threats. The tone of a man who has been made to understand." Sir Barnaby swallowed. "And if he suspects a toupee, he will," Holmes answered quietly. "But he will come all the same. The man who constructs miracles lives upon attention. He has staged a ceiling walker in order to make you feel powerless. Tonight he will want to see you confirm that feeling in ink." The letter was brief, and when it was done, Holmes read it once, nodded, and tossed it to Lestrade. Have it delivered by the same messenger or method. If it goes by a certain boy or a certain tradesman's runner, do not alter that. We are not setting a trap with new cheese, Inspector. We are letting the rat return to the crumbs he already knows. Lestrade hesitated. And we do nothing about Hargreaves in the meantime. We do something better, said Holmes. We do not chase the decoy. I had remained with the child until she slept more naturally. And now, returning to the study, I found Holmes in that dangerous mood of concentrated calm which always preceded decisive action. He pulled from his pocket the soldier stencil and set it on the desk beside Sir Barnaby's seal. A clever little tool, he mused. It tells me 3 things. First, our man has access to nurseries and servants' passages either by familiarity or by employment. Second, he has some knowledge of molding and plaster enough to leave flakes and powder which imitate a builder's debris. Third, he has the temperament of the theatrical criminal. He cannot simply steal and kill. He must also astonish. Lestrade snorted. You make him sound like an actor. Actors, Holmes replied, require audiences. So do blackmailers. He turned to me abruptly. Watson, I want your medical bag. My bag. Specifically, said he, your chloroform, your antiseptic spirit, and that roll of adhesive plaster you keep for inconvenient wounds. I confess I stiffened at the request. Holmes, you cannot mean to defend ourselves without firearms. Precisely. A revolver is noisy and indiscriminate. A drug is quiet and exact, provided the hand that uses it has knowledge. You, my dear fellow, possess knowledge. Lestrade halted in his pacing. This is all very fine, but where's he to come? This meeting, if it happens, might be anywhere in London. Holmes's eyes glinted. Not anywhere. He has already told us where he likes to work. In rooms with ceilings. We waited, therefore, with a patience that was not easy. Sir Barnaby sent his note. The house was hushed. Servants moved like shadows. Even Lestrade's men, posted discreetly at the front and the mews, seemed to breathe more softly, as though sound itself might startle the criminal away. I sat for a time near the nursery, listening to the child's steadier respiration, and reflecting bitterly upon the coldness with which wickedness will make use of innocence when it suits its purpose. When I returned, Holmes was standing at the study window, staring into the fog as if he could read messages in its shifting folds at last. Close upon midnight, the butler brought a card upon a salver. There was no name, only a crude drawing in pencil of a little soldier. Sir Barnaby made a choking noise. Lestrade's hand went to his pocket. Holmes took the card, examined it for a moment, and then held it to the lamp. Graphite, he murmured. Not common pencil lead. Mixed with something. Yes. A draftsman's pencil. A man accustomed to plans. Plans. I repeated. Renovations, alterations, repair work, the theater of ceilings, said Holmes. He has come, as I expected, to the place where he believes himself strongest. Sir Barnaby, you will remain here with Inspector Lestrade. Watson, you will come with me. Lestrade protested at once. Holmes, don't be a fool. Holmes cut him short. If you come, Inspector, you will announce yourself by your very tread. Our man is a spider. He feels vibrations. You will wait. If I whistle once, come, running. If I whistle twice, bring every man you have. He was gone before Lestrade could reply, gliding out into the corridor with that extraordinary noiselessness of his. I followed, my bag in hand, my pulse quickening in spite of my efforts to remain calm. Holmes led me not toward the grand stair, but to the concealed service passage we had discovered earlier. The air there was colder, and the chemical sweetness lingered faintly, as if the walls had absorbed it. He paused at the foot of the back stairs and put a finger to his lips. Then, with infinite care, he drew from his pocket a small mirror and angled it upward. In its reflection I saw, at the top step, sliver of darkness moving, no man visible. Only the shadow of something withdrawn quickly from the edge of the landing. Holmes's mouth tightened. "He is above us," he breathed, "and he has been listening." My throat went dry. "How?" "Because he wants to know whether Sir Barnaby is truly alone," said Holmes. "And because the servant passages carry sound like a trumpet." Holmes took from my bag the roll of plaster, tore off a strip, and pressed it lightly to the stair rail. He then withdrew it and held it to my face. Upon it clung a dusting of gray-white powder. "Fresh," he whispered. "He is passed within minutes." We advanced. Each step seemed to shout in my ears. At the top landing, Holmes halted again, his head cocked, his eyes half closed. From somewhere ahead came a faint creak, like a board relieved of weight. Holmes smiled an expression which, in such a moment, was more frightening than fear. "He is making his miracle again," said he. "Come, Watson. We are about to learn how the footprints reach the ceiling, what price a man will pay to keep them there." Holmes moved like a shadow along the upper passage. His shoulders slightly hunched, his head thrust forward in that peculiar attitude which meant every sense was straining. I followed within a yard of him, my bag held tight against my side to prevent so much as a buckle from clinking. The corridor into which we had come was darker than the rest of the house, for the gas jets were turned low, and the fog at the windows dulled even their feeble glow. Ahead of us, a door stood ajar, so little ajar that it might have been the careless work of a servant. Yet in that hair's breadth of opening I saw a sliver of light and, more important, the faint tremor of a curtain moving, though there was no draught. Holmes halted, raised one long finger, and then sank noiselessly to one knee. He placed his ear to the floorboards, listened, and after a moment looked up at me with a quick warning in his eyes. From within the room came a sound so slight that I might not have heard it at all had I not been expecting dangerous soft scraping. As of something drawn across plaster, Holmes rose, and in one swift motion pushed the door wide. The room beyond was not a bedroom, as I had expected, but a narrow box room used for storing linen and household odds. A single candle burned upon a crate, throwing huge shadows upon the ceiling. And there, beneath that ceiling, stood a man with his back to us, one arm raised. In his hand he held a small pad or stamp, and beside him on the crate was a tin filled with black mud. He was in shirt sleeves, and his hair, dark and thinning at the crown, was dusted with white powder. At the sound of the door, he spun round like a startled cat, and for a fraction of a second I saw his face clearly, sallow, sharp-featured, with eyes too restless for honesty. In that instant he did not flee. He smiled. "So," said he, in a voice oddly cultured for such a place, "the famous Mr. Holmes has followed the chalk line after all." Holmes's expression remained perfectly calm, but his right hand was already in his pocket. "Mr. Hargreaves, I presume," said he. The man's smile widened. "Names are convenient toys, like soldiers." His glance flicked past Holmes to me and lingered an instant too long on my bag. Ah, the doctor. How comforting. If anything should go wrong, we may patch it. Holmes took one step forward. "You have drugged a child. And you have brought drugs of your own." The man returned lightly. "We are all men of science in our small ways." I felt my temper flare, and yet the cold precision of the moment kept my hand steady. "If you have any humanity, humanity." He interrupted with a laugh so soft it was almost polite. "Doctor, I have worked in houses like this since I was a boy. I have carried coal upstairs while gentlemen discussed patriotism over port. I have mended their walls and listened through them. Do you know what plaster teaches? That everything cracks eventually." Holmes's eyes had shifted from the man's face to the corner behind him, and I followed the glance. At first I saw nothing but shadow, then my stomach tightened. A length of rope, thin but strong, ran up the wall and vanished into a small hole at the cornice where the plaster had been freshly cut and painted over. Beneath it, half hidden by a stack of folded sheets, was a narrow board fitted with small iron cleats like the rungs of a ladder laid flat. "You have made yourself a little theater," said Holmes. The man bowed slightly. "A stage needs rigging. Would you like to see the trick, Mr. Holmes?" It astonished your inspector. Holmes did not answer. His gaze had returned to the man's hands. They were stained not only with mud and plaster, but with a faint yellowish discoloration at the fingertips, a stain I recognized with a sudden jolt as something I had seen in hospital orderlies who handled certain preparations too often. Holmes spoke softly. "You killed Lavington with a poison that leaves no wound and frightens the face. Something carried in a bottle, perhaps disguised as a solvent. You relied upon ether to keep the household asleep while you searched for the safe papers." The man's eyes glittered. "Ah, you do observe. How flattering. And the footprints." Holmes continued. "You stamped on carpet and ceiling to produce panic. But you required something else to explain the ceiling prints, some method for reaching the plaster with wet mud." Hargreaves's smile became a grin. "Then you have nearly solved it." "Nearly?" He moved with startling speed. His hand darted to the candle and flung it at the crate. Flame leaped up at once, licking along some invisible trail spirit, no doubt poured beforehand. The linen caught with a hungry whoosh, and in a moment the little room was filled with heat and crackling light. "Back!" cried Holmes, and seized my sleeve, dragging me from the threshold before the fire could billow outward. Hargreaves did not retreat. He sprang instead to the rope, hauled it twice with practiced strength, and I heard a dull click above us, as if a bolt had shifted. Then he sprang past us into the corridor, his shoulder brushing mine, and as he passed, he struck at my bag with his elbow. It fell, spilling its contents with a clatter I could have wept to hear. Holmes was after him like a greyhound. I snatched up the chloroform and plaster by instinct and ran. The corridor beyond was suddenly alive, servants shouting, a door slamming, the thud of running feet below. The fire alarm had been raised, or would be in seconds. Hargreaves raced toward the back stair, but at the landing he did not go down. Instead, he flung open a small door to the attic ladder and vanished upward. Holmes took the steps, 2 at a time. At the top, he paused only long enough to glance at the ceiling above the landing. There, in the candlelight, flickering from below, I saw something I had not expected, a faint line, like a seam, running along the plaster, and beside it, tiny scratches where a tool had been applied. "He has cut a panel," Holmes snapped. "A crawl space." We scrambled into the attic. The air up there was stifling, full of old wood, dust, and the dry smell of stored years. The roof timbers loomed like the ribs of some enormous beast. Ahead, a narrow plank walkway crossed between piles of trunks. At its far end, a small square of darkness gaped in the attic floor, an opening leading down into the space above the ceilings of the rooms below. Hargreaves crouched there for an instant, his face turned up toward us, his eyes bright as a rat's in lamplight. "You see, Mr. Holmes," he called softly, "ceilings are only floors for those who know the house." Then he dropped through the opening. Holmes was at it in a bound. But even as he reached the hole, there came a sharp snap, and the plank beneath his foot gave way. He caught himself by sheer strength, fingers clawing at the edge, and swung back with an agility that left me breathless. Below us, there was a crashing sound, the splinter of wood, and then faint, mocking another sound, as though someone had pressed a stamp against plaster. Holmes's eyes blazed. "He is marking as he goes," said he. "He wants us to follow." From below, muffled but unmistakable, came my own name, shouted hoarsely. It was Lestrade, and in the distance the shrill whistle of constables. Holmes straightened, brushed dust from his sleeve, and his lips tightened into that hard line I knew meant the game had turned deadly serious. "Watson," said he, "he has not merely escaped. He has led us precisely where he wishes on, if Sir Barnaby's papers are already moved. Then his next bite will not be a metaphor. Now pick up your bag quickly. We are going after him into his ceiling." Holmes's words were no sooner spoken than the house itself seemed to awaken into pandemonium. From below came the confused thunder of men on stairs, the shrill calls of servants, and the harsher commands of constables attempting to bring order to a household already half maddened by fire and fear. In the attic, the air lay thick and ancient, and the dust rose in little choking clouds under our hurried feet as we followed the narrow plankway toward the square, opening through which Hargreaves had vanished. I dropped to my knees, peering into the darkness, and felt a faint draught rise against my face, cooler than the attic air, and tainted with that same sickly sweetness which had clung to the nursery. "He has made a flue of the house," Holmes muttered. "A ventilation shaft of his own, running above the ceilings and between the lath. Clever and filthy." He took from my bag the roll of adhesive plaster and, with an economy of motion that in another man might have seemed absurd, tore off 2 long strips. One he pressed to the sole of his boot and then peeled away, examining what clung to it. The other he gave to me. "Do the same," he said. "We must know what we carry into his passages." I obeyed. And when I lifted the strip to the attic lamp, I saw tiny grains of whitish powder, and among them a few specks that glinted darkly. "Charcoal," said Holmes at once. "From soot. He has been crawling near chimneys, Watson. That will tell us where he can emerge." Then, without another word, he swung his long legs into the opening and lowered himself with the sure grace of a man descending a ladder in darkness. I followed, my shoulders scraping the rough timbers, my medical bag slung awkwardly, my heart hammering with the absurd sensation that I had stepped out of the solid world and into some monstrous imitation of it. The space was barely high enough to crawl. The smell of old plaster, mold, and dust filled my throat. Above my head ran joists like the ribs of a whale, and below me, a few inches beneath my chest-high, could feel the hollow give of the ceiling plaster. Fragile as an eggshell dot, Holmes paused, listening. Somewhere ahead came a faint, deliberate tapping tap, tap, tap followed by a soft scrape. It was not the haphazard sound of flight. It was the measured signal of a man who wished to be pursued. "He marks his path," I whispered. "He conducts us," Holmes replied. "And he has chosen his instrument well. If we fire a revolver here, the plaster will shower down and advertise our position to every soul below. If we rush, we may come through the ceiling like clowns in a pantomime. He is counting on our caution." We crawled forward, inch by inch, the darkness broken only by the dim glow that filtered up through hairline cracks, where gaslight from the rooms below found purchase. At intervals, Holmes halted to test the boards with his fingers, then moved on with renewed certainty. Once he stopped so suddenly that I nearly struck his heels. "Look," he breathed. Through a split in the lath, I could see part of a room beneath an empty dressing room. By the look of it, with a gilt mirror and a chair pushed back as if in haste. On the floor stood a basin, and beside it a damp towel. Holmes pointed, and I saw what he meant. The towel was smeared with gray-white residue, and on the chair back lay a pair of overshoes, wet and muddy at the edges. "He changed his feet," Holmes whispered, and he wiped his hands. The actor changing costumes between scenes. He slid forward another yard, and then the space widened slightly near a brick chimney stack. Here the smell of soot was stronger, and the dust lay deeper, as if no one had disturbed it for years, except for a single clean trail. A furrow drawn through the grime like the wake of a boat. Holmes's hand shot out and closed on something. He drew it back and held it in the faint light. A thin glass vial, stoppered with cork, half empty of a pale fluid. I took it, uncorked it cautiously, and sniffed. The odor rose sharp and sweet, with an edge that made the back of my nose sting. "Ether," I said, "or very like it." Holmes's voice was grim. Then Lavington died with this taste in his room, and the child slept with it in her lungs. Our man is not merely a thief, he is a chemist by habit or by apprenticeship. We crawled on, and the tapping ahead ceased. In its place came a low sound, as of a man breathing through his teeth. Holmes slowed until his movements were almost imperceptible. Then, with exquisite caution, he pressed his eye to a crack between boards. I did the same, and what I saw sent a cold shock through me. Below us was Sir Barnaby's study. The old man sat at his desk, his face sunk in his hands. Lestrade stood near the door with two constables, their silhouettes hard and watchful. The firelight threw long shadows across the carpet. And behind the very curtain that concealed the service door there, was a bulge. A subtle swelling, as if the fabric had been pushed from within. A hand emerged, gloved, deliberate hand, drew the curtain aside by a finger's breadth. Holmes's breath hissed softly. "He is already in the room." "How?" I began. Holmes's lips barely moved. "The chimney, or the panel. He has another entrance." Below, the gloved hand withdrew, and a figure slipped out so smoothly that for a heartbeat it seemed the man had flowed rather than stepped. He wore a servant's coat and cap, the kind any footman might don in the confusion of the night. But his posture betrayed him, the head slightly cocked, the shoulders too alert. In one hand he carried something small and dark. Lestrade, to his credit, turned at once, as if instinct warned him. He took a step forward. "Halt!" he cried. The intruder sprang not toward the door, but toward the desk. Sir Barnaby looked up, his mouth open in a silent cry. The man's hand flashed, and I saw then what he held. Not a pistol, but a thin little blowpipe, and at its end a dart no longer than a match. Holmes's face changed. All the icy control vanished, replaced by a terrible swiftness. "Now, Watson," he snapped. He drove his fist down upon the lath before us. The plaster beneath gave with a cracking sigh, and with one fierce wrench he tore a jagged hole wide enough for his arm. He thrust it through, dropped, and for an instant hung like a pendulum, one hand gripping the broken edge above, while the other reached blindly downward. I did not think. I acted. I seized his coat at the shoulders to steady him, feeling the boards bite into my palms. Holmes swung, caught the cornice below, and dropped into the study with the impact of a falling cat. The intruder spun at the sound and sprang back, his blowpipe lifting. Holmes was upon him. There was a scuffle brief, violent, soundless, except for the grunt of exertion and the scrape of boots on carpet. The dart flew wild and struck the wall with a soft tick. Lestrade and his men rushed in. Sir Barnaby stumbled back, overturned his chair, and clutched at his chest as if his heart might burst. The intruder twisted like an eel, wrenched free for an instant, and flung something into the fire. A sheaf of papers caught, edges curling black as they began to burn. Holmes gave a cry of fury and lunged not at the man, but at the flames, snatching the papers with his bare hands even as the fire bit. He flung them to the carpet, stamping them out, his fingers reddening, his face set in a savage concentration. The intruder used that heartbeat to bolt for the service door. Lestrade pursued. One constable caught him by the coat-tail. It tore away like cheap cloth, and the man vanished into the passage beyond, leaving behind only a scattering of white dust and on the study threshold, a single tin soldier, its painted rifle still fixed in mute salute. Lestrade's shout and the thud of boots on the service stair brought half the house in pursuit. But Holmes's hand closed upon my sleeve and held me a moment in the study. His fingers, I observed with a professional wince, were blistering where he had snatched the papers from the flame. yet he neither looked at them nor acknowledged the pain. He had gathered the scorched sheets from the carpet with the same cool care he might have used for a rare manuscript, smoothing their curling edges and holding each one to the lamplight in turn. "Enough survives," he said. He meant to destroy, not to conceal. That is always the act of a man who has lost control. Sir Barnaby, trembling violently, sank into his chair as if the joints had failed him. "My God," he whispered. He was in the room under my eyes. "You are a man who has been trained to look at ledgers," Holmes returned, "not at lath and plaster." From the corridor came the echo of running, a door flung open, and then Lestrade's voice, muffled by distance, calling orders. Holmes moved to the fireplace, and with the poker raked the coals apart. Among the embers lay something that had not burned something too dense for paper. He drew it out and dropped it upon the hearthrug. It was a small metal tube, neatly turned, with a mouthpiece at one end and a narrow bore at the other. A blowpipe more refined than the crude weapon I had glimpsed, and fitted with a little sliding chamber for darts. Holmes's gaze went to the wall where the dart had struck. He crossed, plucked it out with a handkerchief, and held it to my nose. A faint almond-like bitterness rose beneath the ether sweetness. "Subtle, yet unmistakable, prussic acid," I murmured. Holmes nodded. "A touch? Enough to stop a heart if it meets blood, but used here as threat." He never intended to hit Lestrade. He intended to show Sir Barnaby that a child can be made to sleep and a man to die, and that the instrument is small enough to vanish into a sleeve. Sir Barnaby's voice came hoarse. "Then why did he throw the letters into the fire at all?" "Because he came not merely for the letters," said Holmes. "He came for your obedience. When he found the police here, he had to change the nature of the contest. A man will sacrifice his leverage if he believes he can win a greater prize, his own. Escape." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson's voice seemed to echo. Absurdly in my memory, most urgent, and I realized how. Swiftly one crisis had bred another, until the whole house was a hive of terror and smoke. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, attend to my hand later. For now, there is work." The intruder left one honest thing in his haste. He nodded toward the tin soldier that lay on the threshold, its painted blue coat bright against the somber carpet. I picked it up. The toy was heavier than the others, and when I shook it gently, I heard, not the hollow rattle of tin, but a dull click, as of something within striking metal. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A container," said he. "Open it." I tried the seam, and found it had been soldered with care. Holmes took it from me, produced his penknife, and with a precise twist, forced the join. The soldier came apart in two halves. Inside, wrapped in thin oilcloth, was a tiny slip of paper and a fragment of white chalk. Holmes unfolded the paper. In the wavering lamplight, I saw a brief line, written in the same angular hand as the nursery threat. "One more ceiling. South Bank. Midnight." One note Holmes read at once and held it out to Lestrade, who had burst back into the study, flushed and furious. "He's gone," Lestrade panted. Out into the mews. Took a constable's helmet clean off with a brick and vanished in the fog. "We've men in every alley." Holmes pointed at the note. "You have men in the wrong alleys." Lestrade snatched it, read, and stared. "South Bank. What's on the South Bank?" Holmes's voice was clipped. "Warehouses, workshops, theaters, and 1,000 places with ceilings no one watches. Midnight +1 is a jest he wishes to show he can name the hour. But also it is instruction. He expects Sir Barnaby to come alone." Sir Barnaby gave a broken cry. "I will not go." Holmes's gaze hardened. "You will not." "I will." Lestrade's jaw set. "You can't impersonate him," Holmes replied. "Only his fear. Criminals do not read features in fog. They read posture, hesitation, and the weight of a purse. I stepped forward. Holmes. If he has Prussic darts and ether, Holmes cut me off with a glance that was almost tender in its impatience. Then you will come as well, my dear fellow, and do what you do best. But first, we must know which ceiling he means. He crossed to the desk and pulled open a drawer with the practiced confidence of one who knows where a man keeps his secrets. From it, he withdrew a sheaf of contracts and receipts tied with ribbon. "Sir Barnaby," said he, "your contractor Hargreaves was recommended by Lavington. Show me the invoices." Sir Barnaby, crushed into compliance by fear for his family, pointed with shaking finger to a particular paper. Holmes read, his eyes moving rapidly. "Repairs and alterations. Lower Grosvenor Street, and secondary premises, at—" He paused, and his lips tightened. "Ah!" Lestrade leaned in. "Where?" Holmes turned the paper so that we could see. "A storage property leased under an alias. Near the river. And most important, near a building whose very business is ceilings." "What building?" I demanded. Holmes's gray eyes lifted, bright with that fierce intellectual certainty that always made my own doubts seem childish. "A theater workshop," said he, "where ropes, panels, false walls, and stage tricks are made every day. Where a man may learn to walk upon a ceiling because he has spent his life building ceilings meant to deceive." Lestrade's face changed. "Then he isn't some plasterer at all." "No," said Holmes. "Or rather, he is a plasterer as Judas was a disciple. He wears the trade as a cloak. The mind behind this is someone with theatrical craft and chemical habit, and with enough bitterness to use a child's toys as threats." He moved toward the door, already pulling on his coat. "Inspector, you will take men to the South Bank, but you will keep them out of sight. No lanterns waving. No shouting. If he sees uniform, he will vanish again into his own shadows." Lestrade hesitated, pride battling reason, then nodded sharply. "And you?" Holmes's smile was thin. "I shall go where he expects Sir Barnaby to go under a ceiling of his choosing, and I shall bring him down from it." I confess that as we hurried out into the wet London night, the fog pressing close and the lamps smearing into halos, a most singular thought came to me. We were no longer chasing a murderer through drawing-rooms and alleys, as in so many of our adventures. We were entering a world of trapdoors, rigging, powders, and painted illusions where a man could leave footprints on a ceiling, and where the very air might be drugged at a breath. Holmes, striding ahead with the impatience of a mind that has seen the end of the path, seemed less like a detective than like an actor stepping onto the stage at last, certain of his lines, and determined to force the villain to speak his. The hansom set us down near the river where the fog lay thicker, yellowed by the lamps and fouled by the damp breath of barges. Holmes paid the man and stood a moment with his head tilted, listening not to the water's lap or the distant rumble of wheels, but to those subtler noises which most men never truly hear, the creak of rigging on a moored craft, the far-off clang of a workshop bell, the muffled laugh of a costermonger somewhere in the murk. The South Bank at night has a character of its own, less the polished menace of the West End than a gritty, workmanlike secrecy, as though every alley were an agreement and every doorway a compromise. Lestrade had kept his promise. I caught sight, through a veil of mist, of two constables loitering with studied indifference beside a stack of crates, and another pair across the street pretending to argue over a match that would not strike. The rest were scattered like chessmen, placed for a game whose moves only Holmes could see. The inspector himself hovered in the shadow of a lamppost, his collar up, his eyes narrowed against the wet. Holmes drew me close. "No heroics, Watson. Our man is armed, and he has no scruple. If he can poison a child to frighten her grandfather, He will not hesitate to silence a doctor who happens to be in his way. I have no wish to be heroic, said I, only useful. Holmes's glance softened for an instant. That is why you are always both. We moved along the river road, boots whispering in the wet grit, until Holmes stopped before a long, low building whose outline was barely visible. A faded signboard hung above a side door, its letters washed pale by rain. Behind the grimy panes came a faint glow, and, more telling, the intermittent clatter of metal upon wood-like tools set down and lifted again. A workshop, I whispered. A workshop, Holmes agreed, and one with a night watchman who is either absent, bribed, or unconscious. He sniffed once, and his mouth tightened. Ether again. The door yielded to his hand with a pressure so light that I marveled at it. Inside, the air was warmer and thick, with the smell of sawdust, paint, glue, and lamp oil. Shapes loomed in the half-light frames of scenery. Stacked flats painted to resemble marble columns. Ropes coiled like sleeping serpents, and a ladder rising toward a catwalk above. Somewhere deeper in the building, a man coughed, the sound quickly smothered, as if by a hand. Holmes did not go straight. He never went straight when a criminal expected it. Instead, he slipped behind a painted wall that pretended to be the frontage of a Venetian palace, and led me through a gap between two great canvas backdrops. We passed a table where pots of pigment stood open, their surfaces skinned over, and there beside them lay a tin soldier, upright, its painted face turned toward the door like a sentry. Holmes did not touch it. He merely looked, and I saw in his eyes that quick calculation which always preceded certainty. He places them not at random, he murmured. He places them where the eye will snag, where the mind will remember. Tokens to make fear portable. A faint sound came from above, the soft slide of a rope through a pulley. Holmes's head snapped up. He caught my sleeve again and drew me back into shadow. A lantern swung briefly on the catwalk, casting long bars of light across the workshop floor. In that harsh illumination, I saw a man standing high among the beams, his silhouette narrow and intent. He held something in his hand, a long tube, perhaps a blowpipe, perhaps merely a length of metal. Beneath him on the floor, directly under the catwalk, was a chalk circle freshly drawn. In its center sat a stout leather bag, the mouth tied shut with twine. The purse, I breathed. Holmes nodded. And the stage mark. He is timing an entrance. A voice came down from above, soft and taunting, the cultured accent now unmistakable. Sir Barnaby, it called, you are punctual at last. I had begun to think your courage had failed you. Holmes stepped forward into the light in one smooth motion. Shoulders slightly hunched, head lowered. The very picture of an old man frightened into obedience. He had taken Sir Barnaby's overcoat and hat, and with a few strokes of soot and a change in posture, he had achieved a resemblance sufficient for fog and lamplight. You wanted your meeting? Holmes called up. His voice altered, thinner, older, trembling by design. Here I am. The figure above laughed softly. Excellent. Put the bag inside the circle and step back, slowly. Holmes did as instructed, and I saw his hand steady as iron placed the leather bag precisely where the chalk line enclosed it. Then he retreated, the perfect obedient victim. Yet even as he stepped back, his fingers brushed the chalk mark in passing, and I knew he had taken a trace of it. Now, said the voice, you will receive what you have earned. There was a click above. Something moved. A panel painted to resemble a patch of night sky swung down on hinges, and from it descended, very slowly, a length of rope with a small wooden platform attached. A stage lift, crude but effective. Upon it rested a metal tin, rectangular, like a document case. Holmes lifted his head as if in hungry relief. My papers. Your shame, corrected the man above. Do not sentimentalize it. The platform reached the height of Holmes's hands. He grasped the tin and set it on a work table. His fingers moved along its edge, found a clasp, and then very deliberately he stopped, as though struck by doubt. "What is it?" The man called Holmes looked up. "You have been in my house," he said, voice still Sir Barnabas, but sharpened now with something else. "In my granddaughter's room." A pause brief, dangerous. "A necessary lesson," came the reply. Holmes's disguise fell away like a cloak. "And Rupert Lavington." Another pause, and then, with sudden venom, unnecessary silence. Holmes's eyes blazed. "Then you are a murderer." There was a rustle above, a shifting of feet. The lantern swung again. I saw the man's face more clearly between the beams Hargreaves's restless eyes, Hargreaves's powdered hair. But there was something else now. A second man behind him. Broader, half-hidden, holding a coil of rope as if ready to haul the platform up in an instant. Holmes had seen it too. His hand darted to the tin, and opened it, snatched out what lay within. Not papers, but blank sheets, carefully weighted to mimic their feel. The true letters were not here at all. Empty. Holmes snapped. A final deception. From above came a sharp, delighted laugh. "Of course. Did you imagine I would bring my fortune within arm's reach? Your yard dog is somewhere outside, Mr. Holmes. I can smell the uniform through the wood." Holmes's voice was like ice. "Then smell this." He raised his arm, and I saw the small vial of ether we had found earlier. With one swift motion, he flung it upward. It struck the beam near the lantern and shattered, and for an instant the air glittered with droplets. The lantern flame flared wildly, and the workshop filled with a sudden, suffocating sweetness. The two men above coughed and recoiled. Holmes sprang for the ladder. "Watson," he shouted. "Now?" I ran forward, snatched the blowpipe dart Holmes had kept wrapped in his handkerchief, and with the other hand seized my chloroform and plaster. My mind, trained by surgery, worked with cold clarity. If a man must be taken alive, he must be taken quickly, before panic turns him to a cornered beast. Holmes was halfway up when the broader man behind Hargreaves kicked at him. Holmes swung aside, clung with one hand, and with the other struck upward, hard, precise. The man grunted and staggered. Hargreaves, choking, turned and fled along the catwalk toward a narrow door at the far end and exit into the roof space. No doubt another ceiling road. Holmes gained the platform. "After him?" he cried. I climbed as fast as my lungs would allow, the ladder slick under my palms. Below, the chalk circle and the leather bag seemed suddenly absurd stage properties in a drama, whose ending had turned real and savage. From outside came Lestrade's distant whistle, once sharp as a knife. Men were moving. The net was closing. Holmes reached the catwalk door just as Hargreaves slipped through it. He slammed it behind him, and I heard the scrape of a bolt shot fast. Holmes smiled grimly. He would retreat into his ceilings again. He turned, scanned the catwalk, and seized a coil of rope from a peg. In 3 swift motions, he looped it round an overhead beam, tied a sailor's knot with practiced certainty, and handed me the free end. "Watson," said he, "hold fast. If he thinks the ceiling saves him, we shall tear the ceiling open." Holmes's rope bit into my palms as I hauled, the coarse fibers burning through the damp of the night air that seeped up from below. He had looped it about a beam so that the pull came true and steady, and now he braced his feet against the catwalk rail, his lean body set like a lever. The narrow door at the end of the platform shuddered under the strain, its bolt protesting with a thin metallic scream. "Steady, Watson," he said between clenched teeth. "Not strength or action." I shifted my grip, set my shoulder, and pulled again. The wood cracked. A sliver sprang free and clattered down into the workshop. Somewhere beneath us a man shouted, and I heard the heavy tramp of Lestrade's constables forcing their way through the lower door. The ether-sweet air had thinned, but it still hung in the rafters like a ghost of our enemy's habits. Holmes ceased, pulling abruptly, and pressed his ear to the door panel. For a heartbeat, all was still. Then came the faint scuffle of hurried movement on the other side, and a soft rasp rope sliding over timber. "He is rigging another escape," Holmes murmured. "He has a line to the roof." Before I could answer, he drove his shoulder into the door with a violence that startled me from him. The weakened frame gave it. The bolt tore loose, and the door flew inward, revealing a cramped passage between trusses where one could only stoop and crawl. A lantern guttered on a nail, and in its dim circle stood Hargreaves, half turned toward us, his face streaked with sweat and plaster dust. Behind him, the broader man, his silent accomplice, was already clambering up a slanted ladder toward a roof hatch, hauling a coil of rope like a sailor escaping a sinking ship. Hargreaves did not run at once. He lifted the blowpipe. I saw the glint of another dart between his fingers. "You should have stayed in your parlor, Mr. Holmes," he said, breathless but still cultivated. "This is where ceilings are born. This is where they kill." Holmes's eyes flicked to the dart. "Careful," said he softly. "Your hand trembles. A man who traffics in poisons should not drink fear so deeply." Hargreaves's lips curled. Fear? No. Only time. His gaze darted past Holmes to the passage behind us, listening to the growing uproar below. "Your inspector is coming. I warned you, uniform has an odor." He raised the blowpipe to his lips. I moved without thought. The adhesive plaster Holmes had made me keep ready was still looped about my wrist. In one swift motion, I flung a strip across the blowpipe's mouthpiece. It stuck fast, sealing it as neatly as a surgeon's dressing. Hargreaves jerked back with an oath. Clawing at it, Holmes was on him. His fist shot out, not wild but exact, striking the man's wrist. The dart flew from his fingers and skittered into a crack between boards. Hargreaves sprang sideways, faster than I had believed possible in such a narrow space, and seized a cord that ran along the truss. He yanked it hard. Somewhere above us, a panel thumped. Dust rained down. A square of plaster, cleverly cut and concealed, swung open like a trapdoor lay. It was no door on the floor, but a door in the ceiling of the space below. Through it came a breath of colder air and the faint glow of the workshop lamps far beneath. Holmes laughed a short, fierce sound. "So that is your famous wall and ceiling, is it? A carpenter's hinge and a liar's confidence." Hargreaves's eyes flashed. "Call it what you like." He darted for the opening, intending to drop through and vanish into the confusion below. Holmes seized the rope still tied to the beam and, with a single practiced twist, looped it round Hargreaves's waist as the man lunged. It was done so quickly that I scarce saw how. The blackmailer's body shot halfway through the opening, then snapped back as the rope went taut. He hung for an instant, legs kicking. Like a puppet whose strings had been yanked. From below came Lestrade's bellow, astonished and triumphant. "Holmes, for God's sake, what devilry is this?" "Only plaster and pretense, Inspector." Holmes shouted back, hauling. "Come to the workshop floor beneath the catwalk. Bring handcuffs." Hargreaves clawed at the rope, his face purpling. "You'll kill me." Holmes's voice was cold. "You chose poisons because they leave no mark. I prefer methods that leave a man alive to answer for himself." The broader accomplice above gave a hoarse cry and disappeared through the roof hatch. There was a scuffle overhead, then the sound of boots on slates, running. Holmes glanced up, measuring in an instant the odds of pursuit, and shook his head. "Let him go," he said to me in a low voice. "The second man is muscle, not mind. He will be found when the mind breaks." Hargreaves had ceased struggling, hanging limp with exhaustion and fury. Holmes lowered him inch by inch until his feet found the truss again. The man sagged against the beam, panting like a spent animal. His earlier polish cracked away to show the raw resentment beneath. "You think you've won," he rasped. "But you haven't even found the letters." Holmes's eyes were very bright. "On the contrary. You have told me precisely where they are not, and you have shown me exactly where you learned to walk upon ceilings. That is enough." Footsteps thundered up the ladder behind us. Lestrade burst into the passage with 2 constables, their faces flushed, their hands outstretched. One seized Hargreaves. The other snapped irons on his wrists with a sound as satisfying as a judge's gavel. Lestrade leaned close, breathing hard. "Rupert Lavington," he said. "Did you kill him?" Hargreaves smiled through cracked lips. He saw what he should not have seen, and the child. Lestrade's voice shook with anger now. The child, Hargreaves whispered, was only a lamp. "You men follow light so easily." Holmes's hand came down on his shoulder, not violent, but heavy with finality. "You are wrong," said he. "They follow conscience, and you have none." We returned to Lower Grosvenor Street before dawn, while the fog still clung to the gas lamps and the city's great heart beat dully in the dark. Holmes, silent in the cab, held the tiny chalk fragment from the soldier's hollow body and turned it between finger and thumb as if it were a key. When at last we entered Sir Barnaby's study, Holmes went straight to the repaired wall where the first footprints had ended. He pressed the chalk to it, drew a short line, and then tapped. The note was different hollow. "Here," he said simply. Within minutes, with a servant's crowbar and Lestrade's grudging assistance, the false panel was pried free. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked within the cavity of the wall, lay the packet of letters stained by time, but intact. Sir Barnaby gave a sound that was half sob, half prayer. Holmes did not look at him. He was watching Hargreaves, who stood in irons. His face now gray with the realization that every trick had been stripped to its beams and hinges. "You see," Holmes remarked. Almost conversationally, footprints do not stop at walls. Men do. And when a man believes himself clever enough to rewrite gravity, he is usually foolish enough to leave his secrets behind the nearest plaster. Sir Barnaby's gratitude, when the recovered packet lay upon his blotter like a relic rescued from desecration, was of that tremulous and extravagant kind which the prosperous affect when the hand of ruin has brushed their sleeve and passed on. He stammered promises of reward, of influence, of discretion purchased at any price, while his eyes flickered from the stained letters to the ironed wrists of Hargreaves with the same expression. A man might give a serpent pinned through the neck. Yet Holmes, who had never had any taste for thanks, turned away from him with visible impatience, and it was only when I caught his hand and saw the raw blisters swelling across his fingers that I understood what effort he had made to keep the whole affair within the boundaries of civilization. "Holmes," I said quietly, "sit down. If you are to go on playing Providence for London, you must at least keep your skin." He submitted with a grunt and allowed me to bathe and dress the burns. Even then, his mind was elsewhere. His gaze kept straying to the ceiling and the repaired wall, as if the house itself were still capable of fresh deceit. Lestrade, meanwhile, had stationed 2 men at every door and window, and stood with his notebook open, as eager as any schoolboy to turn a strange adventure into orderly evidence. "You'll have your conviction now," he said, with a touch of satisfaction. The letters, the false panel, the workshop note enough to hang him twice. Hargreaves, seated between 2 constables, gave a thin, contemptuous laugh. "Hang me, and you hang a rope with no knot," he said. "You have caught the hand. The mind remains above your heads, always above." Holmes did not look up from my bandage. "You are very fond of height," he remarked. "It compensates for something. Tell me, did Rupert Lavington recommend you because he feared you or because he paid you?" Hargreaves's eyes flashed. He paid me to mend walls. He paid me to make his master's secrets safe. Then he tried to make them safe from me." Holmes's voice was mild. "So Lavington knew of Sir Barnaby's correspondence, and you knew that he knew. That is one triangle. But triangles often conceal a fourth point. Who was the foreign agent, Hargreaves? Who profited from those letters besides you?" The man's jaw tightened. For the first time, I saw in him something like caution, no longer the showman, but the cornered criminal measuring what silence might still purchase. Lestrade leaned in, eager. "Answer him. You'll only make it worse." Hargreaves's gaze slid toward Sir Barnaby, and a slow smile crept back. "Ask your gentleman there," he said softly. "He dined with him." Sir Barnaby's face drained. "Lies," he whispered. "He is trying to." Holmes raised a hand, and the room fell quiet under that gesture more completely than it would have under any shouted command. "Not lies," said he. "Not necessarily. The man who builds illusions knows how to drop one truth into them, like a pebble in a pond, to watch the ripples." He stood, his burned hand now neatly wrapped, and walked to the window. The fog beyond had thinned to a gray translucence, and a faint pallor in the east hinted that dawn was approaching. For a long moment he stared out in silence. Then he spoke, not to Hargreaves, nor to Lestrade, but to me, almost as if continuing a private thought. "Watson, do you recall the tin soldier I found on our stair before Lestrade arrived?" "Perfectly." "It was not brought by accident," said he. "It was placed as a signature, an announcement that the game had already begun. Our man wished me to be involved. He wished me to see the ceiling." Lestrade bristled. "Are you saying he planned for you?" "I am saying," Holmes returned, "that he planned for attention. But he did not plan for scrutiny." He crossed to the desk and took up one of the letters with a pair of tongs Lestrade had obligingly produced. For the inspector, whatever his faults, was quick to learn when Holmes's eyes were on him. Holmes held the sheet to the light and studied the watermark, the fold, the ink's faded character. "These were copied," he said, "not merely stolen. Copies were made at some point, perhaps by Lavington, perhaps by someone who stood behind Lavington. The originals you have recovered may satisfy Sir Barnaby's terror, but they do not necessarily extinguish the danger. Blackmail seldom relies on a single document. It relies on the belief that more documents exist." Sir Barnaby made a small sound of misery. "Then I am not free." Holmes's gaze was sharp. "You were never free. You purchased silence, and then you discovered that silence has heirs." Lestrade cleared his throat. "So what now? We've got Hargreaves." Holmes's face had that curious look it assumed when the chase was ending, not triumph, but a kind of austere disappointment, as if the world had once again proved less intricate than it pretended. "Now," said he, "you will do what Scotland Yard does best when it is wise enough to do it. Follow the money and follow the trades. Hargreaves has workshop access, chemical supply, and a talent for stagecraft. Those things leave trails, purchase receipts, apprenticeships, theater contracts. The second man, the muscle, will be found when he seeks his pay or his shelter." Hargreaves's composure cracked. "You think you can read every shadow," he spat. "But shadows are infinite." Holmes turned, and in his gray eyes there was a coldness that made the criminal's theatrical defiance seem suddenly small. "No," said he, "but men are finite, and every man who believes himself a phantom eventually grows hungry for some solid thing: coin, praise, revenge, or comfort. When he reaches for it, he leaves fingerprints, even if he prefers footprints on ceilings." Lestrade's men hauled Hargreaves to his feet. As they led him out, the criminal's gaze flicked once more to the ceiling, and I saw in that last gesture the true essence of his obsession: not escape, but superiority and infantile delight in being above other men, literally and figuratively. It was perhaps fitting, then, that he should be taken away through a plain doorway, under an ordinary lintel, with his boots on the floor like any other miserable creature. When the commotion had passed, Sir Barnaby sank into his chair and covered his face. The house seemed suddenly older, as if the night's revelations had peeled away some varnish of comfort and exposed bare wood beneath. In the quiet that followed, Holmes returned to the hearthrug and looked down at the two halves of the tin soldier, still lying open like a dissected insect. "It is curious," he said at last, "how often men use children's things to signal adult cruelty. A toy is meant to train the hand for play. In such hands as his, it trains the mind for contempt." I finished tying the last knot of his bandage. "And what of Sir Barnaby?" I asked. Holmes's mouth twisted. "He will survive. Men like him always do. They survive by paying others to carry their fear." Outside, the first weak light of morning crept into the room, turning the fog from yellow to pearl. Lestrade's voice sounded in the hall, brisk again, already shifting to the next file and the next urgent mess. Holmes watched the changing light as if it bored him. "Come, Watson," he said, and reached for his coat. "There will be no more footprints on ceilings today. London will return to its usual, honest crimes. And he paused, and the faintest smile touched his lips, "I shall try to persuade Mrs. Hudson that a man may be burned for the sake of truth and yet still require breakfast." With that, we left Lower Grosvenor Street behind us, the house shrinking into the fog like a bad dream dissolving at dawn. Yet I confess that, for many days afterward, whenever I looked up at a ceiling weather in a drawing room, a hospital ward, or our own familiar sitting room in Baker Street, I found myself imagining, with a shiver half ridiculous and half sincere, the sound of a soft stamp pressed against plaster, and the steady progress of mud where no mud had any right to be. The fog had lifted by the time we reached Baker Street, though London still wore that washed gray look which comes after a night of rain, when the cobbles shine and every passer-by seems newly scrubbed and singular. Mrs. Hudson met us with exclamations over Holmes's bandaged hand, and with the brisk maternal tyranny that no amount of genius can withstand. She forced a plate upon him and a cup of tea into my own. Holmes submitted with the ill grace of a man who considers digestion an interruption. Yet I noticed that he ate more than he would have admitted, and that the warmth of the room, the crackle of coal, and the homely clatter from below soothed even his restless nerves. For myself, I confess I was glad to sit with my boots off and the familiar surroundings about me. For there is something in the return from danger which makes one acutely aware of comfort, as if the body, having been held taut, were suddenly permitted to slacken. Yet my mind would not entirely release the images of that strange chase among beams and plaster. The sight of Holmes hanging half through a ceiling like a figure in some grotesque pantomime, and the cold malice of the little tin soldiers, each one a toy turned into a threat. Holmes lay back upon the sofa, his long legs stretched toward the fire. He stared for a time at the ceiling of our sitting room with that absent analytical gaze which I knew so well, and I could not help imagining what tricks a man like Hargreaves might attempt even here were he mad enough to try. At last Holmes spoke. "It is an odd thing, Watson," said he, "how the public prefers mystery to method. If I were to publish the mechanism by which those ceiling prints were made, half of London would be disappointed. They would rather believe in devils than in hinges." "And yet," I replied, "it was precisely the hinges that saved Sir Barnaby's reputation and perhaps his life." Holmes gave a short, humorless laugh. His reputation was never in danger from a hinge. It was in danger from his own vanity. A man who buys silence eventually discovers that silence has a price that increases with age. "You are hard on him," said I. "I am hard on facts," Holmes returned. "Men like Sir Barnaby do not sin for pleasure, but for convenience. And convenience is the most prolific mother of crime in England. He reached with his good hand to the side table and drew toward him the tin soldier I had kept as a grim souvenir. Its two halves were soldered again, for Holmes had insisted, with a peculiar fastidiousness. Upon restoring the thing to its original shape, as if to deny it the dignity of having been useful, he turned it over, inspecting the seam. Hargreaves, he continued, was a symptom. The disease is older and sits at better tables. A secretary grows tired of guarding his master's shame. A contractor grows tired of mending walls for men who never see him. And between the two there arises that most dangerous of sentiments, resentment. Armed with ingenuity, do you believe, I asked, that Lavington was in league with him from the beginning? Holmes's eyes narrowed. In league? Perhaps not. But he opened the door. He recommended the repairs. He gave access. He may even have copied the letters for insurance against his employer. Then the contractor who had the theater man's love of spectacle and the chemist's contempt for bodies saw what leverage could buy, and decided that the master of the house should be terrorized into paying more. And the second man? I pressed. Holmes shrugged. Muscle hired from the riverside. A man who carries ropes for a living and asks no questions so long as coin answers. He will talk in the end when he realizes that the mind he served will not return for him. Criminal partnerships are like stage duets. Watson, the moment one performer believes himself the star, the other begins to resent the lighting. I could not help thinking of Hargreaves's last look upward. Always upward, and the strange childish satisfaction with which he had tried to make the world tilt. He wanted to be above us, I said. He wanted to be admired, Holmes corrected. Even feared admiration is still admiration. That is why he left the soldier on our stair, why he marked walls, why he wrote notes instead of merely stealing. He could not bear to do an ordinary crime. He required an audience. Scotland Yard provided one, and he attempted to make me his principal spectator. And did he succeed? I asked. Holmes's mouth twitched. He provided an interesting evening. Nothing more. I dressed the last of Holmes's blisters and watched him flex his fingers with a faint frown, as if irritated that flesh should be so easily damaged. Outside, the street noises, rose-milk carts, the cry of a newsboy, the distant rattle of an omnibus. The world had returned to itself with astonishing speed, as if London could absorb even the most grotesque drama and still find room for breakfast and gossip. Holmes, I said at last, there is one thing I do not understand. If the letters were hidden behind the wall, why risk bringing them to the workshop at all, even as a decoy? Holmes's eyes flashed with approval. Excellent. That question, Watson, is the difference between a story and a case. Because he did not know whether his hiding place was safe once I was involved. He suspected I might search the house. So he attempted to draw us away toward the south bank, toward rigging and chalk circles, while the real packet lay behind plaster that had been repaired by his own hand. His greatest confidence was in his own workmanship. That is why the footprints stopped at the wall. The wall was his altar, and the ceiling. The ceiling, said Holmes, was his sermon. He sat up then, suddenly brisk, and reached for his violin. The first note rose thin and sweet, and with it some of the night's oppression seemed to fade from the room. I realized, as I had many times before, that Holmes required not rest, but release. Not sleep, but the cleansing discipline of sound. As I write these lines, I am aware that some reader, hungry for marvels, may feel disappointed that the ceiling walker proved to be no spirit, no demon, but only a bitter man with a rope, a panel, and a bottle of ether. Yet I would remind such a one that the true horror lay not in the mechanism, but in the motive. For when a man can take a child's toy-an emblem of innocent plaisant, turn it into a courier of threats, when he can use a ceiling not as shelter but as stage, then we are confronted not by the supernatural, but by something far more common and far more troubling: the cold inventiveness of human malice. Holmes ended his phrase, lowered the violin, and looked at me with that curious detachment which nevertheless never quite concealed his affection. "Put it in your notes, Watson," said he. "If you must write of it, write of the wall. Men build walls to keep things out, but more often to keep things in." In the end, Hargreaves did not walk upon ceilings at all. He walked upon the credulity of honest men. And that, he added, with a faint sardonic lift of his eyebrows, is the easiest surface in London to tread.